been an incredible afternoon so far, Karen and Tracy. And as I think about it, one of the threads I have seen is about deploying resources for greater impact. And that's what we're here on our panel to talk about today, investing for impact investing. It's a field, as many of you know, that has grown a lot since the term was coined at a Rockefeller convening in 2007. And yet, for many of us, we still bifurcate in our minds the idea that investing is what I do to maximize my returns, and giving is what I do to maximize my impact. So two wallets, essentially. You know, this is how I make money, and I give away money to have an impact. And what we're here to talk about today is that space in the middle. And, you know, in many ways, what we've been talking about as well together today is that as a society, we are grappling with so many enormous societal, economic challenges, and we give so generously to address them. You know, $500 billion, $500 billion just last year. And in many ways, grant making is an essential tool for many of those challenges. But other of those challenges, we think about the climate crisis. I saw Chief Hoffer coming back in, just dwarf in scale the amount of grant making that's available to us. And also in many cases, there are business models that can be invested in to address those challenges. And when we invest to maximize our impact with sustainable returns, we can create those new models. We can deploy new forms of capital and make really exciting things happen. I mean, Justin talked about the example of, on the one hand, you could be granting a scholarship to an individual, and on the other hand, you could do something like we're talking about with the Google Social Finance partnership, whereby you provide somebody with a zero interest loan, and then as and when that's paid back, you can recycle and serve more and more learners together. And hopefully, as he said, achieve $1 billion of wage gains in the process, a scale you couldn't possibly achieve with that same amount of grant making because we are deploying capital from their balance sheet. So it's an unbelievably exciting field. And yet a lot of challenges remain. It's a fragmented investment landscape. You know, the task of completing financial and impact diligence is meaningful and expensive and hard. And so we hear from a lot of investors, philanthropic capital managers in particular, that they're curious, they're interested in doing something different with their money, but it's hard. And it's hard to know where to start. It's one of the reasons at Social Finance we've tried to create an on-ramp to impact-first investing. And the panel here has helped us, each in their own way, think about our fund that deploys capital towards a diversified pool of economic and social impact investments, everything from affordable housing to rural economic development to climate infrastructure in low and moderate income communities. So with that, let me introduce the panel. To my left, I have Rebecca Moffett, the third president of Vanguard Charitable, a leading DAF provider and prominent grant maker. Rebecca, as it says here, is a dedicated, but I would add humble and passionate leader and advocate in the DAF space, really focused on thinking about the benefits of giving for donors, for nonprofits, and for our communities. John Green is the co-founder and managing principal of Blackstar Real Estate Partners, and he's going to tell you more about that in a minute. But he brought to Blackstar 20 years of real estate and finance experience, having managed $5 billion in commercial, multifamily, residential, and mixed-use properties across the United States. And then last but not least is Liesel Pritzker Simmons, the co-founder and principal of Blue Haven Initiative, where she and her team focus on generating both financial returns and impactful outcomes, and also is the board chair of Impact Assets. So let me get us started, perhaps with John, who we are proud investors in John's fund. And they do meaningful and exciting and impactful work. Could you start by telling us a little bit about what you do and bringing to life for everybody this idea? What does it mean to invest for impact, and how do you all do it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you so much both for having me today as well as for your partnership over time. It's been everything for us. So good afternoon. My name is John Green. I am managing principal of Blackstar, as Kirstin mentioned. We are a real estate investment management company that stabilizes communities by expanding the equitable ownership of affordable single-family homes. So in particular, we focus on this sort of naturally occurring segment of the market that tends to be generally $100,000 and less with most properties over time, that tend to transact in financings by instruments that are often alternatives to traditional mortgages. In particular, these sorts of alternatives to mortgages that result in families taking on the burdens of ownership without the benefits of actual ownership. What we do for those families is we change the lives of workforce families by converting those forms of financing into traditional mortgages, and in those transactions afford a lot of benefits to those families. What we do, broadly speaking, is to acquire large pools of properties that are encumbered by this sort of alternate form of financing at discounts. We work with the families that occupy those homes in order to, at fair terms, with mortgages that we take back, transferring ownership in that process. We hold and season those loans that we create for a period of time to demonstrate performance, and then eventually sell those loans in the secondary markets and recycle the capital. That's transformational for the families that are involved in some ways that I will touch on briefly. But in particular, what I would say is that these transactions tend to happen not just with instruments that are alternate to mortgages, but ones that I would characterize as at best problematic, more commonly outright predatory. And what we do in these transactions is take these contracts for deed and similar sorts of instruments that are predatory in ways that take, when I say it takes the obligations and burdens of ownership, think maintenance, insurance, taxes, in a transaction that ultimately the sellers retain ownership. Less than 1 in 5 of these transactions ever results in the families that sign up for these contracts ever eventually owning these properties. And we turn that process on its ear. When we look at these transactions, a big part of why we chose to focus on them is the fact that first, so many of the families that enter into these have no idea that they do not actually own the property. So they think and behave as actual owners. They invest real capital and sweat equity only to find out too late that they don't actually own the properties. They tend to happen at above market prices in terms of interest rate and the actual price. And those those obligations travel without the benefits. So not only do they not own, they have no rights to the equity, they have no right to transfer, to lease, to realize any economic benefit until the very last payment is made, which happens vanishingly a vanishingly small percentage of the time. Unfortunately, it is subject to very few consumer protections that are provided, and it has existed for over 100 years, essentially unscathed by any sort of legislative or policy interventions, especially at the federal level. So it is a huge, huge industry. There's more than $200 billion of this product that's out there. There are more than 8 million families in this country that are affected by it. And it is a problem that tends to happen disproportionately in low-income and minority communities. What is one of the cruel ironies of this is that this is a symptom of a much larger problem, which is that small balance mortgages tend not to be available. It has much less to do with any elements of creditworthiness or financial wherewithal of those families. It has everything to do with the economics of lending. The fixed cost of originating small mortgages is unattractive, and it became less so over the last decade plus. And so as a function of that, a stat to remember is that properties less than $100,000 nationally, of those properties, less than 30% are actually financed with a traditional mortgage. And so in the vacuum that's created by that, you have these alternative forms of finance that have taken root and become the only alternative for families. And what happens as a result of that is that the liquidity in those housing markets is diminished. The home ownership in those markets is dramatically reduced. The incentives and the capital to reinvest in those markets is significantly reduced, and equity is stripped. What Blackstar does is to take a common sense, market-driven approach to help these families to finance their properties and to reduce the cost of ownership to keep them actually in their properties. Our results to date have really underscored the wisdom of the approach. When we measure ourselves across our indices of performance, we look first to wealth creation. To date, for the families that we've worked with, we've transferred on average more than $40,000 to those families. For those families, that represents a more than 20x increase in their net assets. We measure off of net assets because so many families have negative net worth when we account for their liabilities. Their monthly principal and interest payments have come down on average by about 30%. For families that are underwater, they have negative equity that we absorb, so we reduce their any negative equity. To date, that's happened for about 13% of our families, and we've reduced their principal balances by about 25%. And when you look at the penalties in this space, the way that they tend to be applied are akin to the payday lending industry, where the penalties are very much an intentional aspect of the revenue model. We extinguish those out of hand. So roughly 40% of the families that we've served have had penalties and arrearages of this sort that we've extinguished to the tune of roughly 1.7 times their net assets. So this was an important hurdle to them ever becoming homeowners. So to date, we have served hundreds of families. In our pipeline, we have thousands, and with a partnership of organizations like Social Finance, we've been able to have our fingerprints all over policy that will affect millions. In just the last several weeks, potentially the first federal legislation around this has been proposed on a bipartisan basis that was informed in part by testimony that we provided to the U.S. Senate Banking Committee, but we've also been fortunate enough to engage with the CFPB, with the Federal Reserve Boards of Cleveland and Minneapolis. I'll just part by saying, in our judgment, and a big part of why we do what we do is the notion that for capitalism to work better, you have to have more capitalists, and that ultimately the barometer for that is ownership. And so we're excited to partner with Social Finance in the process of helping to influence that.
Thank you. Incredible, right? When you hear about it, it's...
Thank you.
I think for many of us, when we hear this story, you feel shocked and ashamed that this is still happening at this scale in the United States, but proud that there are teams like that led by John who are working to make a difference. Speaking of working to make a difference, Liesel. Liesel, Blue Haven, I think, is one of the first family offices that was really, dedicated to having impact at its core of how it operates. And in that, you're really operating across kind of many different buckets that we talked about, right? So you're thinking about allocating capital to, financial return generating investments, to grant making, and everything in the middle. How do you think about that? How do you decide what to do, how to allocate capital, what to do with which form of capital? Share with us your process and thinking.
Of background, Blue Haven is a single family office that I run with my husband Ian, who's up here and is officially on the Social Finance Board. The way that we kind of stumbled into how Blue Haven works today was basically, I grew up in a very wealthy family. I inherited a ton of money when I was 21 years old. So this was almost 20 years ago. And wanted to do something really great with it. And the playbook at that point was you set up a foundation and you learn how to be a strategic philanthropist, which is awesome. And absolutely, we need many more people of wealth to do that. And so that's kind of what I started to do. But what I also kind of, at that time, so I was at Columbia University, it was when they set up the Earth Institute, it was Millennium Development Goals, it was market-based solutions, Muhammad Yunus, microfinance. That was all kind of the fun, interesting stuff that was going on when I was an undergrad. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And I'm learning to be a thoughtful philanthropist and data and market things and all of that. This sounds really promising and interesting. So I went and I worked in microfinance, saw some things that were interesting about that, some things that didn't work. But one of the things that I was really struck by was kind of markets are everywhere and they're working all over the place and probably in places that you care about, regardless of whether it's healthcare or forests or conservation or education. There are markets functioning in all of these areas. And so that was one kind of big moment. Then the second moment was I realized I kept on missing, with this inheritance came a set of financial advisors from a very traditional large, firm, and they were great, they were wonderful, but again, this was 2005, so the term impact investing hadn't been coined yet. You sort of bring things up like that, and they're like, well, we'll divest from tobacco, and that was sort of what was on offer. And at that time, I thought, okay, that's fine. I'm focused on the philanthropy. But again, the more I got into market-based solutions, the more I would call up my advisors from wherever I was in West Africa or in India. They're sitting in Chicago. And I was like, could I invest in some of these market-based solutions? Like, now I'm working on a program. We've developed this whole loan portfolio for schools all over Ghana. Now we're going to microfinance investment vehicles and larger capital markets, and I'm fundraising. And actually, hang on a second. You guys must know some of their investors. Could we actually connect the dots here? And they were like, oh, sweetie. They were like, that's very cute. You go back to Ghana, you leave the investing. To us, we understand what we're doing. And then 2008 hit, and we were like, nobody knows what they're doing. And so why don't I actually, I'm going to kind of stick to my guns on this one. And let's start from scratch. Let's not. First thing let's do is let's say that everything that's invested out there in the world, every buck that's out there, is doing something. It is. It's having an impact. Whether or not you're measuring it or whether or not you are intentional about what that impact is doing, it's doing something. So the first thing is, let me look at my own portfolio. And let's very slowly, I want to actually understand what do I own? What is it doing? Are there data service providers that can tell me what they're doing? Not really at that point. There were some. How do I get a better picture of actually what my relationship as an investor is to the stuff that is already in my portfolio? And that started this kind of whole journey. And we said, we want to do it with everything because I don't understand, I can't hold that many thoughts. I can't be a little bit pregnant. Either it's having an impact or it's not. I can't do it with a portion of my portfolio. So I want to look at everything. And let's start from there. And let's understand, where do we want to focus? Where are actually capital markets very good at scaling things that we know work? Where are they making a massive mess? And I want to stay out of. Where could it work, but not yet? It could, but we need a lot of other things to fall into place in order for something like that to scale. And so from that standpoint, we just sort of slowly started looking across the portfolio. And as investments started to distribute, or just as a natural investment portfolio starts to cycle, we just sort of upped the ante for each of the things that were in there in each of the sub-asset classes. And I think any impact investor will tell you there are certain asset classes that are easier to fill than others. There are some that just don't lend themselves that well to, impact investing, some very, very derivative-driven financial instrument. There's stuff like that I think is I'm not sure we'll ever see super amazing impact products in those spaces, maybe. But that's essentially what we started to do. And also through that process, saying, where do we not want to make a profit? Where does it make sense? Where should markets stay away? And where should we let very wonderful, smart, data-driven philanthropy play where it really should. And then also, what's the kind of the policy and civic engagement piece around that as well? Like something we care deeply about, and really my husband's work has been on this for decades, is around youth voter engagement and voter turnout, voter access, campaign finance reform, and tax reform. I don't want profits anywhere near those conversations. They should stay away from them. That's appropriate. And so that's sort of how we've started, how we think about our portfolio at Blue Haven Initiative. And we're in a very luxurious position of being a relatively small investment committee that can look across those different things and try to partner where we can and allocate capital where we can. And that's where we can be creative. We're a family office. We can do C4. We can do, we can say words like advocacy that a lot of C3s and foundations can't. So that's fine. Let's play that role and let's do that. And so that's how we think about it broadly. But then when you start getting into the weeds, things unravel. So yeah.
In exciting and new ways.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah.
Okay, Rebecca, you're the president of Vanguard Charitable. Probably most people are familiar with DEFs, but maybe just a brief level setting. How do I think about donor and what is a donor advised fund? And then maybe you can go a little deeper. As a donor advised fund sponsor, how are you thinking about and engaging with this concept of the space in between in terms of impact investing and how it interacts with charitable giving?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's certainly a newer area for us, so we're continuing to learn. But a donor advised fund, at its core, as many of you may know, is a really flexible charitable giving tool. It enables individuals to make an upfront and long-lasting commitment to charitable giving. They can make a philanthropic gift or contribution to a donor advised fund sponsor that is a 501c3. They receive a tax benefit for that gift. Those dollars are then invested in a series of investment options so that those dollars can hopefully grow tax-free, all for charitable benefit. And of course, the most important piece is that those donors can recommend grants out of that account in the near and long term. And that's absolutely happening. Donor advised funds are becoming a really critical part of the grant-making ecosystem. I think last year alone, we saw more than $45 billion go out to hundreds of thousands of organizations across the US and beyond. And those numbers are continuing to grow over time, which is really exciting. And so, we sit at a really interesting part in the ecosystem, and as we think about how we may play in the impact first space and in impact space in general, we take a step back at Vanguard Charitable and say, we can either do that on the investment side or we can do it on a grant-making side. And eventually, over time, we may do it in both. But for right now, engaging in impact first on the grant-making side as part of our grant offer is really important and has been really beneficial to our donors. And so we're able to do that through a recoverable grant offering. So a recoverable grant offering is where the donor can recommend a philanthropic gift to an organization. That gift has certain terms and circumstances around it, and should those terms and circumstances be met, that gift can be recovered into the donor advised account for future philanthropic impact. I think what's really unique, though, about this type of structure within a donor advised fund is that if those terms are not met, that recoverable grant gets turned into a traditional grant, and the organization keeps the dollars regardless. And so there is absolutely impact being created there. We can only do this, though, through partnerships. So there's been a theme of partnerships through all of the sessions today. And so through partnerships with social finance, who have the social finance Impact First Fund, we're able to provide those opportunities to our donors.
Now, all of you, as we've just heard in a lot of ways, are powerhouses in your own right. There are any number of things that you could be spending your time and energy on. Not this, right? I mean, and John, you were managing, traditional real estate portfolios. So why does this matter? I mean, and Liesel, you touched on it a little bit already, but we can go deeper. It's like, why does this matter to you? Why are you spending your time on it? Why do you think other people should care? John, do you want to start us?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I see the work that we do today as very much an extension of why I got into real estate and commercial real estate to begin with. I wanted to affect the way that people lived and worked and played together. And by investing and by developing, I was able to accomplish that. And some of the sorts of projects that interested me most were these sorts of public-private partnerships and these sorts of opportunities to affect mixed-use developments that had people interacting in all sorts of interesting ways. And among the sort of ironies of often the sort of mixed income components of residential properties are that the solutions to affordable housing, aside from the fact that they tend to have more complicated capital stacks and executions, are that almost invariably they're focused on multifamily and rental, never on ownership. And when I started to look at issues that really affected me personally and the sort of impacts that I wanted to have on the world, I looked at things like the wealth gap that was mentioned earlier today. And the wealth gap is huge, and if you look at the components of that, for middle-income Americans, more than 2/3 of their wealth is associated with their primary residence. The homeownership gap today is wider than it's been in over 100 years. And if you think about that and put it in context, it means that the homeownership gap today is wider than it was before the passage of the Fair Housing Act, before the Civil Rights era. You have to go back into the Jim Crow era of this country to have as wide a disparity in home ownership along racial lines as we do in this country. And I felt that the skills that I had and that I was able to develop doing commercial real estate could be applied. And to Liesel's point, using a market-driven solution to address this problem that had existed similarly for more than 100 years without meaningful policy or market intervention. And so we recognized an opportunity to take that sort of work that we had been doing for me personally and for members of my team to be able to apply it in that arena. So for us, it really was recognizing this sort of opportunity to do that at scale.
What about you, Rebecca? I mean, it's not easy at a large organization to try something new.
That's right. I think the reason why we think about this and prioritize it really is for two main reasons. Number one, donors are asking for it. I mean, they are coming to us, they are asking us about opportunities. I mean, the entire reason that we entered into the recoverable grant space is because we had donors who said, we were looking to give to this organization, they have structured this thing, can you do it? And we were able to take a step back and research and say, yeah, we absolutely can. Donor behavior is shifting significantly. It is much more creative, donors are much more thoughtful, and they are trying to learn about how they can use these assets that they have set aside for charitable giving and really amplify them. And this is one way that we can meet those needs. But I think on the other side is we partner a ton with nonprofits. We are a grant maker at our core, and organizations are asking us to deploy grants in this way. It provides them with the flexibility to, when they receive a recoverable grant, to then think about their fundraising strategy and have the recoverable grant really be the patient capital at the bottom of the capital stack for repayment so that they could be thinking about more creative ways. And so to be able to meet the needs of both donors and their emerging thoughts and trends, as well as organizations who are asking for it, I think is a really exciting place to be.
Liesel, when I turn it to you, could you maybe give us another example from your experience to bring this concept to life for everyone, something you've invested in or that kind of...
Well, sure. I mean, there's actually a good example here in the room, actually, of a partner that we have worked with, I think, with every possible capital type we have to give at Blue Haven, which is saying something, over the years. And I think a really good example of also how being flexible in the kind of capital you provide helps organizations as they grow too, because there's all sorts of different things that spin out of this. And in the impact investing space, you get really kind of creative things that need also some blended and stacked capital so that you can get a bigger institution in that says, well, we can't, we don't even look at fund ones. I can't even believe we're looking at this, but we could if there's this guarantee or there's this loan loss or there's this. And so you can get more creative ways for kind of capital to come in and leverage. And so Prime Coalition is an organization actually based here in the Boston area that is a catalytic capital intermediary, really, that helps, that originally was set up to help bridge this valley of death for hard tech, clean tech startups that, until very recently, clean tech venture capital would not touch, and basically said, no, we want to wait for proof of concept. We're not interested in investing in that. We're all very scared from the clean tech bubble. We won't go into it. But we need those new technologies to get developed in order to meet our climate targets and all of that. So there wasn't a lot of capital from the venture side going in there. And so Sarah, who founded Prime, one of the first ideas was, well, hang on a minute. What if there's a lot of foundations that say that they have charitable capital and they care about climate change? What if some of that charitable capital could be used as this sort of patient capital, this first super risky capital to come into these companies, and then maybe once they've, there's a proof of concept, there's actually market rate capital on the back end for it. But if those foundations, if it's really working, they should get a slice of that too. Like, that's all right. And if it doesn't work, it becomes a grant. And so how do we use PRIs, or, as it turned into a whole range of different capital tools to help support that particular valley of death. And now what's happened, so it started with syndicating deals. So we've given a grant, we've given operating grants, unrestricted grants. We came into a syndicate. We came into the first fund. We've come into the second fund. And not only have we looked at it, we've done it from our DAF, we've done it from the family office proper. Not only have we used those different tools, but it's actually now hits different investment committees within Blue Haven, because Azola, which is a really wonderful, proper clean tech fund now, we don't consider it from our kind of philanthropic investment committee. It's from the family office investment committee. And so, not only have we used different tools, but as the organization has grown, it now has different kinds of products that fit those different gaps. And so that's one example. But always leading with what those impact targets are, but where they invest and why they invest and how de-risked they are is a little bit different. And that, I think, mirrors how how philanthropists should play with philanthropically allocated dollars as opposed to market rate investors. And that's fine. There's enough of us. We should be playing across all of that.
Okay, we are almost at the end of this panel already. I want to see if there is a question in the room before I go to our closing question here.
This is a question for Liesel. So, Liesel, could you talk a little bit about your thinking for, as you go from a fully market rate to a recoverable grant or something like that, can you talk a little bit about your thinking? What's the give up that you're willing to make in terms of a market rate of return? And how do you think about the extra amount of impact that you need in order to motivate you to make that investment?
Great. So the way that I think about it, so if something is in our market rate portfolio, or if it's moving into that, think about it, relatively traditionally in the sense that it's a risk-adjusted return comparable to its peer set from an asset allocation perspective. However, everything we look at, we try to find investment opportunities where the impact is baked in to the investment opportunity or into the business model. And so that doesn't always happen, and then it gets booted out into a different part of the portfolio. But what we've found is there's enough really interesting opportunities where the business metrics of that portfolio actually align and grow with the impact metrics of that portfolio, or they actually end up being the same, or similar things that we target. So first of all, for the market rate portfolio, we won't look at it unless we've found that actually it's because of that investment opportunity. So, things, financing for solar fields, like if the metric we care about is greenhouse, or if it's direct air capture, if it's this, there's all kinds of considerations, but climate's a relatively easy one to say, the more of this, then the more of this, yay. And so that's the first step, is we're trying to look in our market rate portfolio for those kinds of opportunities. That does not always happen. And when we see something that has really amazing impact that actually we wouldn't consider against its peer set to have a market rate of a risk-adjusted return, but this impact is really amazing and interesting, then we don't benchmark it against a market rate portfolio. We benchmark it against, well, what if I gave that money away towards that impact? So if I gave that money away, would I get more impact than if I invested it in this? My benchmark becomes a philanthropic result versus a market result, because I can't get it in the market. Or maybe I can, maybe we gotta go looking. But specifically, if they're not in lockstep and there's a trade-off, of which there are tons, and if an impact investor says there's no trade-off, they're lying. There may not be in that particular investment, but in the world, in the universe, there are, and that's fine. So then what we do is say, okay, well, hang on, is it better that, what's the best use? How should we structure this so that it's gonna achieve the greatest impact per dollar? And sometimes the answer is it's a grant. Sometimes, nope, it's totally a grant. Sometimes it's get this guy elected or this girl elected. Sometimes it's, well, wait a minute, if we can sit at the bottom of the stack and we can wait there for 20 years, that's awesome. Maybe that's more dollar per impact. And so that's then how we look at it. And then we sort of set budgets for those things, and we find some patterns and trends, right? Climate and energy, we tend to find a few more things that are in lockstep on the market rate side. Financial inclusion, financial services, yeah. Early childhood education in hard to reach parts of the world and country, no. Trade-offs, and that's totally fine. So we start to notice patterns in those places as well.
What a perfect summary to end this panel. Thank you all for joining us.